Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome once again to another CryptoManiacs podcast on the glorious Hive blockchain, of course, streaming on vim.tv. We're on YouTube, and we're going to be uploaded on ThreeSpeak. And Task is here, but we got a special guest, Task. It's funny because we were having a few technical difficulties, and I was giving technical advice to the guy who's basically created the Hive blockchain. And I'm sitting here going, oh, yeah, you should try refreshing it because, take my advice technically, right? I mean, block trades, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back, sir. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
For sure. So Task, man, how was your weekend, man? You ready to go? You selling all your crypto? Because the markets are going south, and we should all abandon ship, right? That's what we're doing. No.
No, I saw the hurricanes rolling in last week, and I made the decision that I would keep my crypto safe by moving it all to FTX, where I knew it would be safe, and that way, in case the wind came through and blew my place away, my crypto would be safe. I spent a few days dealing with the wind or the potential wind, and then that leaves, and of course we get the crypto hurricane called Sam Bankman-Fried, which we'll get to in a second, Dan. But when I announced that you were coming on, I put out on Twitter, I did get a question from the Peanut Gallery, and this came in from Mr. Starkers, and he says, "How does it feel to be the top Speak token holder?" Inquiring minds want to know.
I guess it's pretty good.
You never really thought about it, but now that you do, it's pretty cool. Matt,
I had a suspicion that might be the case, but I wasn't sure until now.
Well, Matt, if you're listening, he's not unhappy about it. FTX, what's your take? Let's take the big elephant in the room. What's your take on it? What's your viewpoint? How far do the tentacles reach? You're in that type of business. You run an exchange. Obviously, it's a little different setup, but you don't custody any funds or anything like that on behalf of clients. But what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, obviously we operate a quite different exchange, and primarily for the reasons of what happened just now. The whole custodian issue becomes a real problem if you're not very careful. And unfortunately, the exchanges don't tend to be really careful. I mean, at its heart, I think people should know when they're trading on centralized exchanges or any exchange with this custody involved, that it's not a good idea to leave too much crypto on one of these exchanges for too long. They're okay to put some money down, do some trading, but don't leave it there. Keep the crypto in your own wallets. And this is not a new problem. This is a problem everybody should have been aware of for a long time. I mean, we know that the problem, I guess part of the problem is that custodians don't really do a good job of showing what they're keeping in funds. So you have no idea really how your money's really being stored or if it's being stored at all, right? I mean, so here's just a classic case. I mean, these guys basically were trading with their customers' funds, and I mean, this just shouldn't be done. I mean, if it is done, there need to be very upfront, clear notice of that it's going to be done to their customers, and the customers have to understand what risk is involved in that. So I mean, there's all these staking options now where you can stake your funds on an exchange and then they'll use your funds, and then you should at least be aware why somebody giving you this extra interest. Obviously there's some reason, so they're making money off your money and there's some risk involved. But when there's no staking, even I just think that's totally unacceptable that they would use customer funds in such cases. So I don't really know the details here. I don't know if the funds that were used were staked or not staked, but my strong suspicion is that they weren't, and that the customers were just totally clueless that their funds were being used for other purposes.
Yeah, and then they were, from what I understand, they shifted them over to their Alhambra arm or whatever it is. And
Alameda, that trading company.
And then they were levering it up, and I mean, this is MF Global all over again, except using customer funds this time instead of investment funds. But
they're backing with their own token. Even instead of they get the customer funds and then they back with their own token instead. That's just insane.
Yeah.
Frankly.
What do you think if you could put your forecasting hat on? What do you where do the tentacles of this lead, and what kind of, I don't want to say damage because that's the wrong word. I mean, we're just clearing out a lot of bullshit, so that's not really damaging. But where do you think the fallout on this leads to? Any idea?
I don't really have a good clue, honestly, because I don't know who basically. I mean, it's going to come down to who had funds there. That's going to be a big thing, and I don't know who their customers were really. I've not. I mean, I've been aware of FTX. It's not something I ever followed much because, frankly, I just don't trust a lot of those kind of organizations, and I stay away from them. I've never even traded on FTX, to be honest. That's how.
Same with me. I haven't even touched this stuff that seems to be always in the news, like Terra Luna and FTX.
Yeah, same here. Never touched any of it. It's
and
just hype machines.
Sorry,
whenever you hear those hype machines, you should just should just go on alert immediately. I understood it's likely to impact Solana, for instance. Is another one I've heard, and it's the problem with all these things is you don't really have a good feel for what's going on behind the scenes. So they're extremely risky to get involved in my opinion, for just that reason. You need something that's very transparent where you can see what's going on. That's what I talk about. If you're going to have your funds tied up in a custody somewhere, there need to be very clear, transparent audits of where those funds are being held. They should be able to check at any time so that you know that your funds are safe. And that's just not done as a rule. I mean, I don't know that people do that, especially all the centralized exchanges. They're very opaque as to what's really going on behind them. So I'm very, very cautious about keeping funds on centralized exchanges. And even on the decentralized ones, you have to be careful sometimes because there's still custody issues there. And if you can see on a blockchain somewhere that the funds are being held, that they're there, then that's one thing. But if they're somehow being not transparently held, like say you've got a fund where they're basically got a token that is a one-to-one with Bitcoin, but you can't see where the Bitcoin is being stored, they're not publishing that data and proving it, then again, you're at risk, the same kind of risk. You just got to be careful.
Yeah.
You're familiar with FinCEN and FINRA and regulators. Oh, yeah. You have to go in that realm a lot and probably have some idea of how regulators operate. You want to venture a guess, and maybe you don't want to touch this one, but you want to venture a guess what you think the regulatory fallout will be from this, and what those people at FinCEN will start doing, and maybe the SEC?
Well, I wouldn't expect much from FinCEN, honestly, because FinCEN, I mean, they might do enforcement actions, don't get me wrong, but I mean, as far as regulatory actions, FinCEN is really mostly focused on anti-money laundering, from what I can tell. Mm-hmm. And that's the information they always, want to track with us and other exchanges is, if you get suspicious, if you have suspicious inflow or outflow of money or crypto, that's what they want to know about. So they're not really involved in like the custody issue, I think, so much. SEC definitely is more likely to be involved, but again, it's going to come down to whether they can be a security involved, whether SEC, if there's security tokens involved, then that's SEC will come in. But then again, if there's not, I mean, I think I'm not really sure which organization really would be the ones to oversight exchanges, but most likely it would be, it seems like the CFTC or something like that. Mm-hmm. Would be my best guess, especially if there's any leverage involved. They have oversight in those conditions. If it's just straight token trades, I think they have that's difficult even for them, unless they they can get some new legislation passed to do that. But certainly, I know if there's derivatives, that's where they can get involved. So I think I can't but doubt that there were derivatives on FTX. So I suspect we could see them involved. And SEC may come in if they may try to say some of the tokens traded were securities. And again, I don't even know what tokens were traded there. So, but if something like FTT certainly seems like something they might say was a security.
Yeah. So it's a mess, but it'll be interesting. As I said, it's just clearing out a lot of BS and games and really anti-crypto tenants. I mean, when you think about this is just the established system all over again, just using crypto.
Yep,
the same.
Yep. The problems that resulted here are the same problems that have resulted in centralized, normal trading of typical securities. This same kind of stuff happens, and that's why they've got all those regulations. But yeah, it all comes down to people placing too much trust into too few hands.
Okay. Now, since John does not like non-Hive talk, why don't we focus our attention on
Wait,
Hive?
come on. Like, let's talk about Ethereum now and how much I love MetaMask. No, okay, yeah, Hive, good. Yeah,
How many
like
keyboards he's broken trying to learn MetaMask?
yeah, no, I'm good. Hive talk.
Going in reverse order, we were all told about Hard Fork 26. We were led up to Hard Fork 26, and the next one is going to be, I guess, Hard Fork 28. So there was an extra one snuck in there. Just for clarity, for those who don't know, Hard Fork 27 was to fix a few bugs in Hard Fork 26. What happened? What was the problem? And what did you do?
Yeah, so it's something that I wish it got caught, but it wasn't really a major thing from, I guess, most users' perspective. So essentially, when we made the changes to the witness schedule to handle the one block irreversibility, the OB feature, it had a side effect that we didn't manage to catch in testing, frankly, and we should have, because we had everything in place to do it. Essentially, what happened was there was a change that affected how backup witnesses got scheduled. So that normally witnesses would get scheduled. Backup witnesses basically get scheduled on how high they are in terms of how many votes they have relative to each other. So if you have like 10 times more votes than somebody else that's a backup witness, you're going to get about 10 times more blocks over time. So, but the change we made had this really unanticipated effect in this algorithm that, frankly, we've never even messed with, because it's just been there and it's been working. But we changed this one thing about a time. There was a time stamp that got changed as part of the scheduling changes, because now we look forward. We schedule not 20 witnesses in the future. We now schedule 40 witnesses in the future. So we schedule two witness schedules in advance now. And this was just helpful for OB, so that OB could know that the witnesses that were voting on the current block were going to be scheduled they were still witnesses that were going to be scheduled. And this was the thing so that we could handle if, say, witnesses got voted out, we would recognize that they got voted out, and their fast votes wouldn't count towards fast confirming blocks. So we now see further into the future as to who the scheduled witness will be. But this had this very strange side effect in this algorithm for who the backup witnesses which backup witness was to get scheduled yet. And we were scheduling witnesses a bit more randomly. And ultimately, it had to do with vote changes in the backup witnesses. When there were vote changes in the backup witnesses, that could cause different witnesses to be scheduled next, rather than, the different backup witnesses scheduled. So some backup witnesses were getting scheduled much more often than they should, and others were getting scheduled less. It didn't affect the top 20 at all, but it did affect it in the short term. It affected rewards for the backup witnesses in terms of who got what. Over time, it would have worked out, and generally people would have got the same, backup witnesses would have got the same amount, but it wasn't expected, and it was a little harder to predict. So we definitely knew we needed to fix it. It didn't impact regular users at all, so no one really saw it except for the backup witnesses, and which is, unfortunately, I think who should have probably seen this, because we ran a mirror network. We had full witnesses on there. We had backup witnesses on there, but essentially none of the backup witnesses, I think, were looking at the mirror network, so they didn't see it, and certainly we didn't see it too. So there was no test written to test this backup witness algorithm, because we've never touched it. So I think everyone's a little more aware now, especially the witnesses, that they need to be helping us out with testing a little bit more, especially when it's in their own best interest to do so. So I suspect next time around, there will be a lot more interest in seeing what's going on in the mirror network before we release. So anyways, we figured out the problem in basically the first day. We thought we knew what it was, but we had to confirm it. So that took probably another day or two. And then we had to write tests to be sure that the fix that we were pretty sure actually worked. So, and there wasn't any real rush to do it too quickly. I mean, sure, the backup witnesses weren't happy, but it wasn't impacting anyone else. So we took our time and made sure we got everything fully tested, so there would be no further problems. And that's essentially what got fixed in 27.
And it was rolled out in a week and a half anyway. I mean, it wasn't like
yeah. I mean, it was yeah. I mean, we could have rolled it out in a day, frankly, but it wouldn't have been tested well in that time, and it would have worked, but I didn't want to take any chances. We wanted to be very, very sure everything was firm.
I was bugging my business partner when that happened, because I was like, dude, like, we haven't got a block in like 24 hours. He's like, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And I'm sitting there thinking we broke something. So I'm bugging him, and he hates me already. So me bugging him even more is just like driving him nuts. And he's like, no, it's actually, they're just doing a patch and it'll be fixed. But I'm sitting there going, dude, this isn't right. Like we're not like 150th. We're in the 50s here. Like what's going on? Why aren't we getting a block? He's like, no, it's okay. They got to fix. It's coming. But again, this is why you don't lead me to the technical.
There were a lot of backup witnesses that were in that same very uncomfortable state for a few days there. And, we told them we had a fix coming, but still, I think, everybody gets a little nervous at times, especially if it's income related. But I mean, I'd calculated out it wasn't going to be a major impact for the amount of time involved for anybody. So that wasn't.
No, it was all good. It was just, it was more stressing my buddy out. That was more for me. I was fine, but stressing him out, I think. Anyways, yeah.
So that explains 27. 26 was, from what I've been able to ascertain based upon what some people said, it was actually a very large hard fork. And most people, for the users, I think for the average user, the only thing that was applicable is the resource credit delegation that I guess Howu was pretty much responsible for writing. And there's 1,000 articles on Hive that pertain to that. So if you're interested in that, go look that up. But there's a couple key things that you did that I think are important that didn't get a lot of publicity that I'd like to get some insight from you on. And the first thing is the reduction in the size of the blockchain, if I'm saying that correctly, where you had a 50% compression. What did you have to do from that? What triggered that? I know you're big into scaling. You're always thinking about that. And what does that do for the blockchain going forward?
Yeah, I mean, you hit your head on the nail there. It's definitely about scalability. We wanted to lower the costs going forward for witness nodes to run. We need to make that as super cheap as possible. Ultimately, part of our goal is to make sure people can run this thing at all times on commodity hardware. So, I mean, we've already seen problems nowadays where some of the big not ISPs, but basically hosting data centers are saying they don't want to run blockchain code. I mean, things like this. So we need to make sure that people can essentially run these nodes out of their house if they need to, so that we have true decentralization. We're not too dependent on very large centralized clouds-based web servers and things like that. So cutting down the space that's used is definitely one of the aspects of that. It also lowers the cost for people who are running on cloud servers because disk space does come in, something of a premium once you get past a certain size. So as far as what we had to do it, we essentially made some tests with various compression algorithms that were out there. We included what's one of the newest and cleanest standards for compression algorithms. It gives us a lot of flexibility. We can change that algorithm in the future if we want with the library we're using. And it's also you don't literally have to use the compression option, although I don't anticipate anyone won't, because it is just a savings. It actually probably winds up increasing performance, if anything, because even though there's compression involved and it takes some CPU, it also requires less. You can read more data because it's compressed. You can read it faster, so the I/O is faster in that sense. It's almost like a 2x increase in I/O if you look at it from a data level rather than a compression, actual hard raw data level. But if you look at it, the actual data level, you're getting about 2x. So that's just really a win for us because nowadays I/O comes at more of a premium than CPU because most computers now, most CPUs now have plenty of cores, so a few extra cores. And that's another thing that we did with all the compressions done on we multi-threaded this thing so that it's not single threaded. It's the decompression and compression are all run on multiple threads.
Yeah, you bring up something interesting, and when you look out over the next 3 or 4 years, obviously this is a problem. I mean, anybody dealing with data this is not blockchain. This is not Hive. This is anybody dealing with data from data centers and Google and Facebook and whoever. The more data that's created, somehow it has to be, warehoused and processed somewhere. And compression is a big thing. What do you think as you look out over the future and you're trying to map this in your mind, if you will, about how to keep scaling this stuff and compression? where do you think this goes? I mean, are these compression algorithms and this stuff that people in the industry are bringing forth, are they outpacing the data explosion, if you will?
No, not at all. It's the
Okay.
reverse.
So,
I mean, at 2x compression, we're not going to get much better. I mean, that we probably reached a limit of what's close. I mean, we could get a few percent, but it's diminishing returns after what we've done already, really, frankly, for this data. I mean, it wasn't like this data was super compressible to start with. The most compressible part of it is actually like the custom JSON, that kind of stuff, which is normally text. But a lot of the base primitives are all already fairly optimized for space usage. So yeah, we can't really look to compression to do much more. I do have some other ideas though for ways that we can improve this further, and we've talked about them and I'm sure we're going to implement them at some point. So one of the things we looked at is more decentralizing the storage itself. So right now, each witness node keeps all the data on each node, but we really can come up with ways to reduce that need so that some nodes can store some of it and other nodes can store other parts, things like that. And this will allow you to do things too, like run a very light node, which doesn't need to store the whole blockchain, for example. So that's all very feasible, and I think something we'll be doing in the future.
So over the next 3-4 years, as you're mapping this out, okay, compression isn't really going to be of much benefit, but there are other things that you can do.
Yeah, compression's done what it can. I mean, it's a nice, 2x is a nice improvement, and it definitely cuts costs, but we're not going to see, I don't expect to see much more from compression, at least not at the Hive D level.
So you're going to have to go other routes on that.
Exactly. Like I said, decentralized storage, I think, is going to be the next big thing.
Okay, excellent. Now, the other piece that I find very intriguing because of the financial implications of it in terms of settlement, and you mentioned it, OB, one block irreversibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people really realize how far ahead, not only in blockchain Hive is, but in the entire financial arena. I mean, when you look at settlement times for financial transactions, I mean, you go to Visa, you swipe your Visa card, the merchant gets paid in 24 or 48 hours.
Yeah.
You try to send a check overseas, it's a week or 10 days until that settles.
It's at least several days in your best case. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I understand it correctly, in most instances, maybe not all, but in most instances, you have the 3-second block time. So the time it takes to create the block, and one block irreversibility adds a few milliseconds beyond that, at least under a second. So we're actually, in many instances, we got settlement of transactions in under 4 seconds.
Yeah. In fact, on average, it's less than that. So you figure out, so it's not like you do your transaction and 3 seconds later a block comes on. So in practice, it's half the time. So 1.5 seconds would be your average time for a transaction to get in a block, if you think about it. So like, say you do your transaction 1.5 seconds before the next block, then you're going to get into the next block in 1.5 seconds, generally speaking. So, and it's probably about 100 milliseconds for the OB confirmation on average, I would say. So yeah, you're looking probably maybe 1.6 seconds, I guess, on average.
And why did you decide to implement that? What does it do in the real world for people?
So, I mean, so first of all, you got to look at what it was before. So before, you basically needed, I guess, something like 15 confirmations, block confirmations before you could be irreversible on a transaction. So you were looking about 45 seconds. And so you don't, on a lot of the front ends on Hive will react faster than that. But when you're building a second layer application that has real money at stake, you can't really afford to just say, oh, I'm going to assume this block won't get reversed, because if you do, and then it does get reversed, real money gets lost in that process. So basically, if you looked at the second layer apps like Deluxe or something like that, you'd see that they were waiting about 45 seconds to a minute after a transaction before they would actually accept it to allow you to do anything in that. And that's just a lot. That's a lot of time. I mean, for a lot of the things that you want to build on a second, like games or whatever, who wants to wait a minute after you make an action before it's really solid? So that's really, the second layer apps was really the driving force for OB. So now they can really react at essentially the same speed that somebody was often doing on Hive, because Hive Hive had reversibility, so if transaction got reversed, that was no problem. But when you had a second layer app that was depending on that, them building in reversibility was a big challenge for them. And one of the things we were doing to sort of solve that was half. But even so, even half was still going to leave somebody with the chance that something could get reversed. And if they had outside actions that depended on that, and then that got reversed, then that outside action is no longer, they shouldn't have done it, but they did, and it's a problem. So this really fixes that. And I would say probably 99% of the blocks that the OB is probably going to confirm it within a block. That's what I've seen so far in practice. And it's pretty much what we expected, because as long as we have high participation in the network, you can pretty much assure a block is going to get irreversible right away, basically, once it's created.
Yeah, and now you compare that for anybody who sent like Litecoin or Bitcoin, and you just watch, how many nodes it takes to confirm, and it takes, X number of minutes. Ethereum, I haven't sent any Ethereum since they switched to proof of stake, so I don't know. But a proof of work, it would take, a few minutes, and then of course Bitcoin can take up to 2 hours before the block is even confirmed. So,
and that's just a single confirmation. I've had Bitcoin transaction take days, and sometimes fail after that.
Yeah, that's true too. Now, you mentioned another important piece. It wasn't part of the hard fork, but it was kind of something you coincided timing wise. Half. Where does that stand? That went live. What is half for those who don't know, who haven't been paying attention? And where is the progress of half now that it is live and developers can turn to it?
So, okay, just starting out, half stands for Hive Application Framework. And essentially, it's our model for going forward for apps to be developed on top of Hive. Basically, what it does is the data gets taken from the blockchain and inserted into a Postgres database. And then basically, anybody can write apps using the data inside that database. And one of the advantages of this approach is it means they can customize the API calls that are used by their app to whatever they need to do. They can structure the data however they want to structure it. So they don't need to go learn a complicated new API in order to develop a Hive app. They can take what they already know about how to work with data in the database and then tailor the back end of their application to their own needs. So, I mean, some of the original ideas from this came out of HiveMind, the app that's used for providing most of the social data on most of the blogging sites and things like that. And so we saw that had a nice way of offloading a lot of that work to a secondary database and made it easier to develop without having to take people who knew C++ or were really good at that kind of thing to basically add their own features to what they could do with the blockchain data. So half is really an extension of that, to where you can basically create your own app, store whatever data your app needs, and not store other data you don't need, and really make easier, more robust applications. So that's kind of what half is in a nutshell. There's more to it, but that's kind of I guess, an initial summary. As far as where we're at, it is live now, but we're still doing, I guess, what I would call ease of use work for half, especially for deployment. We want to make half very easy to deploy. So we didn't really get time to do everything I wanted to do. And I say but I mean the whole team wanted to do as far as making super easy deployment of half. And some of the API nodes are half deployed now, but some of them aren't. In fact, we're not, because we wanted to be one that was not running half, so that people could fall back on us if there was any problems with half. So far, there's been no major problems. I would say there's been some performance issues occasionally, so we're looking into that now. And also, there's just been upgrade issues. We want to ease the method that we want to ease the ability to upgrade the app, half database itself, and then other apps that run on top of it. And so that's kind of what we're working on right now. And I think we'll probably be finished that in, say, probably the next few weeks. So we're also planning to, at the same time, to probably the same time we'll roll that out, we're going to probably roll out a new version of 1.27, 1.27.1, basically, which is this is Hive D I'm talking about now. So we'll roll out a new version of half with easier deployment and some just performance fixes. And we're also going to roll out a new version of Hive D. And the new version of Hive D is basically just going to take a bunch of things that weren't hard fork changes and we wanted to get them in, but we didn't want to put them in before the hard fork because they had been developed too close to the hard fork. So we didn't feel that we should put in too much new code that hadn't been super well tested before the hard fork. So our plan was just to do the hard fork, get that out of the way, and then we'll release this point release, which will incorporate all the stuff that we'd done in the time close to the hard fork, say, I guess the last couple of months. And now that we've fully tested and turns out it all works, and we'll incorporate that. These are mostly like performance changes and things that normal users really won't see, but people who operate nodes will see. So like one of the changes we did was you were talking about the block log, for instance. So now that the block log is compressed, that means it may be the same block log could come out slightly different in size between two different people because two different nodes, because they might start turning on compression at different times. So the data is the same, but the compressed data looks a little different. So that could be slight annoyance for somebody who wants to check that their data is, they want to do a checksum on their block log to see if it's the same as somebody else's. If they just run a simple checksum on this too, they would show up as different now because some different parts of the data are compressed. So what this new tool does is allow you to basically get a checksum that's independent of how the compression is done, so that you can check that your block log is the same, even if it's slightly different compression. So things like this, like I said, a regular user doesn't know what I'm even talking about, but someone who's operating a node knows, and it's very useful to them. So a lot of things like that, and a few just other performance enhancements, et cetera. So I think we're getting ready to deploy. So all this is being timed also. So we're talking about half, but another thing that's being rolled out with half is going to be our half-based hive mind. So that's the last thing that we haven't released yet at all. And so this is a replacement for the existing hive mind application that I was talking about earlier, so that it's now completely half-based instead. And so we're pretty close to finish that now. It's been working for a while. It's been generating the correct data. The only thing is we've just been finding performance problems and fixing them. So I think we're going to do a production test today, running it on our node if all goes well, and see if the performance is now up to what we expect. And I anticipate it probably will be. So if that's the case, then that'll be one of the last big things we need to do before the next rollout. We want to ensure that we can switch to half-based hive mind. So basically, it's just easier to roll out all these things at once, so that nodes, that API operators can upgrade all their stuff at once instead of having to do it, one thing after the other.
You bring up a couple points here with half that I'm kind of unclear on. You mentioned databases and stuff like this. Where is this housed? Is this something that like ActiveFit or Leo Finance would run a half node? Who runs the servers for this? Is this just something centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it a cafeteria plan? How does this all work?
It's kind of open, actually. So at the simplest case, if you have an application that no one else is interested in running support for, then you can run your own. And you can just do the whole thing yourself. So I'd expect a lot of applications will do just this. They will run their own half server, and then their app runs on top of that half server. If it's something that's like an application that a lot of people are using, so we'll take HiveMind is actually a great example of that. So HiveMind is an API that's used by almost all the front end apps that do social media. So where you can blog, basically, they all use HiveMind API. So because it's an API that's used by many applications, the API nodes themselves will be running HiveMind-based half applications. So basically, they'll be running a backend, and then these other applications can come in and can query those. They can also run their own, and they may want to, but it's good to have other ones up, because if theirs goes down, if their local one goes down, then they can just feed back the data over. They can just start querying the data from one of the other public API nodes that are out there. So now it's up to the API nodes what half applications they run. So if you want the backup capability of an API operator running your application, you basically have to negotiate with them. You have to say, look, would you run our application on your server? And if they do, then you have a fallback node for your application. So I think a lot of part it'll come down mainly to how popular is your app, to whether API node operators will be running it, or if you've got some kind of relationship with the API node operator that they'll, your friends, and they'll say, yeah, sure, we'll run your application on there for you. But I think certainly any big app should also be running their own node, just because they can co-locate it with their their other application itself or ultra high speed, and just so that there's a dedicated node running, a dedicated half server running just for their application. That gives them more scalability. And again, it depends on load and things like that. There's a lot of things that dictate it, but there's no fixed. I guess what it comes down to is there's no fixed decision on this. You can run just your own node. You can cooperate with other operators to run your application on their node. It's up to you and them.
So before half, you have all this data that's housed at the base layer, and that's what applications actually have to read is what's in the blockchain, I would presume, or in the API nodes. And now, so what you're saying is the data is essentially being pushed from the blockchain level to half, and these applications just have to tap into half. So half is like a read only to the blockchain, correct?
That's right. That's exactly correct. Yep. And what this does is it lowers the load on those Hive-D nodes, which you're calling the blockchain nodes. That's what it takes the pressure off them and moves it to these read-only nodes that you can get the data from. And you still can do writing. The way you do writing is you just broadcast them as transactions. Those go to the Hive-D nodes, and then the data. So once there gets accepted by the Hive-D, then that written data gets written to the half nodes. But yeah, all the read calls are all going to and that's what you mostly get. You get much more reading of data than you get writing of blockchain data. It's just kind of the nature of things. I mean, it's just going to go more and more that way as more people use the. If you think about it, every time more people start blogging and stuff, they do a lot more reading than they do writing, right? I mean, just of a blog post, how often do you read blog posts versus how often do you write them? And except in task case, I say that's usually.
Somebody's got to fill up those blocks. Might as well be me. Yeah. So basically, every time you click on a blog post, you are conducting a read function, and there has to be a pull request for that data. And right now, before half, they were pulling it from the blockchain, and now by pulling it from half, all that processing doesn't have to take place at the blockchain level. Am I understanding it correctly, or at the API level, I should say?
Yeah, you basically got it 100% correct, except just a small detail that HiveMind was doing some of those calls now. So HiveMind really was already doing an offloading of like, if you asked for a post, you didn't go to Hive-D anymore. You went to this HiveMind database. What we've done is extend that paradigm to basically any API call rather than just the social media calls. But that's essentially what you got. What you said is totally correct.
So it seems the general view, and this makes sense from a scaling standpoint, is you're trying to you're just trying to move stuff further and further out and get it away from the base layer, because I guess there's limitations to what you can do at the base layer. So it's like, if we can move as much data as far out and as much processing further out and let these different apps tap in elsewhere, that just keeps improving the efficiency of the whole system.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it as spreading out the load, right? So if you've got one device that's taking all the load, then it comes under pressure. If you can spread that load out, and that's what we're doing, we're spreading out the load of the reads to these databases that can run in separate threads on separate machines, everything. So you're decentralizing the load, and you've got to do that somewhere or another. I mean, in order to make things scalable.
And then that enhances resiliency, because if you got one node, you're done. One thing you mentioned in one of your posts that I wanted to ask you about, because it was such a big fight, it resulted in a hard fork of Bitcoin. You mentioned block size, and you ran some tests. I remember this going back 6-7 months. You wrote a post. You ran a test on where things were, and you used a couple different block sizes. Can you tell us where are we at now? Trying to go back and remember your post. You ran it where we could like double or triple the size of the blocks or something like that, and you got one result versus this other result. And what are the pros and cons of bigger block sizes, and how does that affect things for the users?
Yeah, I guess that's a really good question. So, I mean, in the tests we've done, tests that take our block sizes up to what is right now the designed max. So the design max, I think, is like 1 or 2 megabytes. Right now we got 64K blocks, just for comparison. So, I mean, we've got a long ways to go in terms of how much space we have to expand how many transactions we can fit in a block. So in terms of the advantages and disadvantages, I mean, obviously one advantage if you have bigger blocks is you can fit more transactions in, right? So that means you allow for more transactions to happen per second, essentially. We haven't really hit that limit with 64K because it's not a lot, but we have blocks every 3 seconds. So we still have a very fast transaction rate, even though we don't have very large blocks right now. I would say we're good enough now. We certainly will have to increase the block size at some point. There's just no doubt about that. So that was one of the things we wanted to test was when we increase the block size, will there be any problems? And we found various scalability issues that we essentially fixed. And that's one of the big things that's, under the hood, nobody sees, but we fixed a lot of things that allow us to nicely scale to bigger blocks. In terms of why you don't necessarily want bigger blocks, well, the answer is actually really simple. It's like, so we have already some limitations via resource credits of how fast the block size grows. Because if you try to spam a lot of transactions, then it costs a lot of RC. But there's another even harder limit, and that's the block size. So no matter how much RC you have and how many transactions you do, there's still a limit of how many transactions can fit into a 64K block. And that means the blockchain doesn't grow faster than that right now. So we have a nice hard limit that witnesses can control in order to make sure that the blockchain doesn't grow too fast and we just don't fill up with a bunch of bloated spam data that we don't really care about. So it's kind of up to the witnesses to decide at the point at where they say, well, it's getting kind of hard. We need to fit more data than we're fitting in. We want to grow a little faster, and we can do that. But that's something witnesses have to vote on essentially. And right now, I don't think there's any clear need.
Yeah, and you brought up something that it was with I think it was in the hard fork. Maybe it was a non-hard fork adjustment, but you had made mention that in your build up to this hard fork, you went through and took a look at the resource credit quantifier, if you will, and you realized, and I guess the major undercharge, if that's the right word, was custom JSONs. And you took a look and you were saying, okay, there were some things off here. And so you had to do a major adjustment to the resource credit. What was that entailing, and how did you figure out how to resolve that?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially the problem was that the resource credit costs were kind of just, I don't want to say the word arbitrary because it's not exactly correct, but they were kind of just, rule of thumb. The original, when they were original, those costs were originally set. They were kind of just said, people just kind of analyzed and said, well, this probably takes this much, this probably takes this much, but it wasn't, I guess, as far as I know, it wasn't very scientifically done in terms of figuring out how much the costs really were. And of course, some of the things is, you could just make mistakes too. So I don't really know the procedure that was used completely, but when we got into it, we found that the costs weren't always accurate. And the most severe one was actually, it wasn't really custom JSON per se, although it did have an impact, especially on custom JSON, was the signature checking costs for transactions weren't accounted for when figuring out the cost of the stuff inside of a transaction. So every operation has to be put inside of a transaction. You can put multiple operations inside a transaction, but that transaction is signed by the user, and that's the thing that says, okay, I did this transaction. This particular account is that responsible for that transaction. So of course the blockchain code does check those signatures, and it's an expensive check because it requires some heavy math operations. So it's a crypto operation. And so those operations are expensive in terms of CPU, and they weren't accounted for. So what this means is every transaction, every operation required signature transaction check, but none of them had that cost computed, which you might say, well, that means none of them were accounted for, so it doesn't matter. But if you had an operation that was particularly cheap already, like a custom JSON, and you're not counting this constant signature cost, then essentially you're totally undervaluing how much it costs to do a custom JSON transaction. or any other transaction that's especially cheap. So very cheap transactions were getting off super cheap when really they weren't accounting for this fixed overhead of the signature checking code. And that's why it really wasn't just custom JSON. It was anything that was super cheap got a little more expensive because this computationally difficult calculation had to be done.
So they were just a way of phrasing it. They were hit proportionally to a bigger scale than, let's say, a blog post, which uses more resource credits, for each blog post compared to each custom JSON.
Yep. Because it's like a constant add to all the operations, and so the ones that were cheap wound up proportionally getting, more expensive.
Now, if I can go back to our 3 or 4 year outlook here, and all that we've been talking about with compression and scalability and efficiency and moving all this stuff around, the goal is obviously that we have, I don't know, whatever, 5,000, 10,000 people daily on Hive doing whatever the heck they're doing. And we want to have the ability to have 100,000, 200,000, whatever the number is. Many people have asserted, and the idea makes a lot of sense, that as more people come online and start doing stuff, the limitation of resources are now being utilized by more people. That's going to send resource credits upward. Is that a correct assumption? And how are ways to alleviate that so writing a blog post doesn't cost 100% of my resource credits if I have 1 million high power? How is it? How do you walk that line of, okay, over the long term, keeping it cost effective so people can actually do stuff? Because resource credits effectively are transaction fees. We don't want to be Ethereum where it's just too damn expensive for somebody to engage. How does that unfold, and how do you prevent against that?
Well, ultimately, this is an engineering problem at the end, right? So, you've got to tailor for what you want to get as a result, but there is literally engineering limitations here. So, there's certainly only so many transactions that can be processed per second. So the way we attack this problem is a couple ways. First and foremost, what we try to do is lower the costs. So you can lower the costs 2 ways, essentially. You can get better hardware, and you can also make the software that you're running on that hardware more efficient. And that's where we're spending a lot of our time. Obviously, you can throw more money at more hardware, but the whole point of this is to try to keep it as cheap as possible too. So our real focus is always on lowering those software costs. And, we've done, I think, a really good job of that. We have plenty of headroom for the moment. I'm not worrying about our hitting any boundaries now after the things we've done over the past little bit. But yeah, there's always going to be balance. So as we get more and more users, we have to consider how to change the software further to handle those loads. So you're going to have to see. I think we can, with what we've done now, really the right transactions is really going to be the limit that we could hit now. I don't see the read with half-based stuff. I don't see we're going to hit a read limit. We can run as many read-only servers as we want to handle whatever load, and but there's still the central point of transactions being processed. They all have to go into the blockchain. That's the one central source. So a lot of what we've done has really been optimizing the crap out of that to really handle a lot of transactions. And we've seen now that we can handle essentially a megabyte of transactions. In 3 seconds. That's a heck of a lot of data. It really is, because we're talking, essentially very small data. We're not talking about images or video or anything like that. So for what we got, I think we're pretty good for a long time now. I don't expect any kind of true resource problems now. There's still open to question, like I said, how fast do we want the blockchain data to grow, because it does increase costs for witnesses and things like that. And, that's the decision they have to make as the guys paying for all that stuff.
Well, and I think at this point, I don't know if that's even being pushed by the user base, because the user base isn't exactly exploding right now. So I don't know.
Right now, there's no immediate issue. And I think we're in a nice position now to scale. So I think we can pretty easily scale up quite a bit now. I don't anticipate any real problems there.
Now that you got hard fork 26/27 out of the way, you care to drop a few tidbits of where the thinking is leading into Hard Fork 28? What are some of the things that the team is talking about and looking at? Where are some areas on the next Hard Fork that have to be addressed in your opinion?
To be honest, that's the one thing we haven't really gone into much,
Okay.
because we're mostly focused right now on the half side of things. So
Okay.
we really think that's where most of the work is going to be in the next, the next phase. So we certainly will be doing more improvements, scalability at the Hive D level, the blockchain node level. But I don't know of anything profound that needs to be done at the moment. Like I said, I mean, we've talked about some things in this show, right? We talked about the idea of decentralizing the storage of the block log data. So that's something that might get done, and that wouldn't even require a hard fork, frankly. So that's the other thing. Hard forks are really only necessary when we change the protocol. If we're just changing performance and not changing the protocol, there's literally no need for hard fork, and that's great because then we don't have so much coordination. We don't have to deal with exchanges, coordinating with exchanges, coordinating with all the witnesses. Honestly, witness coordination is not a problem, but it's more of a pain to coordinate with the exchanges, and they take longer to update. And everybody probably saw that with this last hard fork. It took a while for all the exchanges to update. So we really want to avoid hard forks as much as possible. And there typically shouldn't be a lot of need for hard forks if we do things right, because we're going to be making most of the changes at the second layer with the half and things like that. So all that said, I think other than the things I already talked about already, as far as deploying the new version of 1.27.1 of Hive D, deploying the easing half deployment, and deploying half HiveMind. The next really big thing, of course, is going to be starting work on the smart contract engine and the half-based smart contract engine. So that's where I expect a lot of our resources to be focused in the next, say, 6 months or so.
And that would be like layer 2 stuff you're thinking, right?
Exactly.
Like smart contracts you don't want on base layer.
That's right. We don't want them on the base layer because they can cause lots of problems on the base layer, as has been shown over and over again over time.
I'm waiting for my Hive Classic tokens, though.
Oh, dude, let's do it. I'll go all in on that.
Yeah, well, here's another thing to keep in mind. The way things are going, if you do, let's say, a hard fork in 2023, you mentioned the exchanges, there might be about like 35% less exchanges by then.
Dude, the way it's going, it's going to be finance only, man.
Like, they're dropping like flies. I mean,
yeah, but you know how the exchange is like. There's new ones popping up all the time too. So.
Yeah. As long as if Bankman-Fried stays out of jail, he might be back. Although I don't know if he'll do that. When you take a view of, and we started off with an industry view, kind of an outlook, and we brought it back to Hive. If we step back and we put Hive against the backdrop of the industry, what is your opinion? I mean, John and I have voiced it on this show every week, where we're borderline Hive maxis. We just can't help ourselves. We love what's going on. But where do you think Hive stands in light of a lot of this stuff that's out there? Dan and Starkers talk a lot about, well, decentralization is a nice buzzword, but really a lot of these platforms, even the blockchains themselves, are centralized. Where do you think Hive stands relative to the rest of the industry? I mean, forget the token and market price and all that. We know that markets don't judge shit well. But where do you think, from the technical standpoint, from the engineering standpoint, from the scaling standpoint, just when you look at Hive, do you say to yourself, and looking in against the backdrop of the rest of the industry, we got something really powerful here? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. From my opinion, we have the strongest blockchain in terms of true decentralization. I mean, we've got a ton of programmers out there. They're all working somewhat independently, but cooperatively together. I mean, I think it's just wonderful in a lot of ways. I mean, we don't have anybody who's, I'm probably one of the largest stakeholders out there, and I don't have that much stake, frankly. So I think just from a decentralization perspective, we've got a huge advantage over, most of the blockchains out there. We kind of launched that way too. So there wasn't like this, there was no funding raise or anything like that, which I think is really important nowadays, especially with what I would say is an extremely aggressive SEC out there. So I think we've done a great job on that front. In terms of the technology, it's really hard for someone who, doesn't know technical stuff at the low level to understand, but it's just tremendously different what we've got than what you see most of the blockchains out there. I mean, you can see obvious things like performance metrics, and they're really strong on its own, but the whole idea of this approach where we're moving to the second layer to do all the, I guess, the dangerous stuff that could cause troubles, I think we're way ahead of the curve on anybody else on that as well. So I think I think technologically we're far advanced over everyone else I've looked at least.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. And what I think is interesting is, and they call me, Dan brought this up on one show, and I didn't think about it in that light, but it really made sense. He says you take Bitcoin and they're building Lightning Network. So they're trying to move the transaction off of Bitcoin to a second layer. And that's their transaction layer. And Hive's doing the exact opposite. You're trying to move everything that you can to the second layer and just say, okay, Hive's for the transactions.
Exactly.
And, put this at the base layer and get all this other read-only stuff moved the other direction.
Because the transactions thing you cannot take off the base layer. If you want to be decentralized, you can't take that off. Otherwise, you've lost decentralization when you do it. So you take everything else off and you leave what has to be there. That's the whole point.
Guys, you're talking about the maxis now, okay? They'll tell you, listen to them, okay? It's Bitcoin and nothing else because it's the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, well, Michael Saylor didn't reply to my email to come on the show and talk to us. So we'll be Bitcoin maxi for a while. Well, one thing that and I'm going to be writing a post about this, but one thing that I've been thinking about in light of this FTX, and I've been talking a lot about counterparty risk, and obviously we know this is something most people don't think about. Because, you go deposit your money in the bank, you don't have to worry about the balance sheets of the bank because you're FDIC insured or something the equivalent of that in the developed world.
As long as you don't deposit too much.
What's that?
As long as you don't deposit too much.
Yeah, there's a limit. I forget. I think it's now $250K.
Yes.
But, and then you have the same thing in your brokerage account. I think that's up to $5 million in assets or something like that. But you kind of mentioned it with the FTX and the staking, not necessarily FTX, but you go on these staking protocol or these staking platforms and you move your Bitcoin or your Ethereum or whatever the hell you move on there and you stake it. You are encountering counterparty risk because if that application fails or it's a rug pull or whatever, it's gone. And then, of course, if it's a smart contract, you got counterparty risk actually with smart contracts. If the code is bad and you're opening yourself up to being hacked, and then you got Polygon and BNB, and that kind of is counterparty risk. Maybe it's not great, but it is there. And one of the things I look at the Hive savings, and we take our HBD, we put it in savings, and the counterparty risk is the blockchain. As long as somebody is running the software, I can access my wallet, I can access my funds. Now, of course, you do have the backing agent of $1 worth of Hive, and there's certain parameters come into play, and there's also certain safeguards that have been put into play to protect that. But my question to you, in light of all that's going on out there with the industry, FTX, all this other stuff with Celsius, and this idea of DeFi, which is a great idea, but it turns out it's really CeFi because not much of this stuff is decentralized.
Yeah,
and you mentioned that Hive is probably the most decentralized blockchain. Do you think it would be worthy for us to consider adding some more financial features? Because all we basically have is you have 20% on your HBD, and then you do have the inflation rate on your Hive by staking your Hive into Hive Power. Do you think it would be worth it to consider adding more DeFi features to the blockchain along the lines with what we've had, knowing the industry doesn't have it and the industry's probably not going to get it looking the way the direction goes? Because even if you do something on Ethereum, well, hell, Ethereum's becoming extremely centralized. What are your thoughts on that?
I guess sort of twofold. I guess the first thing is I think before you move something like that, the first layer, you should test it out pretty thoroughly at the second layer. So I think if there's, any DeFi idea that we want to do, I think we do it at second layer first. And if it seems to be sound and, then we can look at moving it to the first layer. I mean, I think the second layer is a better experimentation layer than the first layer. I guess that comes down to that. And beyond that, I think there's certainly room for more DeFi features for sure. I think you need to take a good hard look though at what they are and what they really provide. I think it's easy to. I mean, a lot of people were asking us to just do whatever they heard was the popular thing in the DeFi space, and I was always very resistant to that idea because I don't know how they'll play out, and some of them have risks. I mean, some of them have regulatory risks, frankly, too. So I think you have to be very, very careful about adding DeFi, and we don't want a bunch of regulators coming after us for doing something that they say is wrong. So I generally better on the second layer, because then all that can be attacked is the second layer, and the first layer stays clean.
I just want time vaults on Hive. Lock that HBD up for
That's what
a
I was
year.
about to say. This guy just wants his bonds, man.
Yeah,
That's all he
that
wants.
one I think is pretty reasonable, and I think something like that could definitely be added without a real problem at first glance.
Do you agree with this? How do I phrase this? You mentioned the second layer. If you build something like this on the second layer, as long as you're dealing with some type of decentralized node system or some node system, can that be as resilient as the base layer, where you don't need to build it on the base layer anyway?
Yeah, it absolutely can. Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, you could just mirror the governance model that's on the, I mean, this is one way to do it. I'm not saying it has to be done this way, but you can essentially mirror the governance model on the second layer that's done on the first layer, and have decentralized nodes that are processing the data, so that, they have to follow the rules. And if they don't, they get kicked out by the other nodes. So again, it's spreading. It's just like running witnesses here, right? I mean, you basically do the same thing at the second layer. And the first layer is basically just ordering the transactions, saying this is the order in which they happen, and then the meaning of them is assigned at the second layer. But the second layer, from that sense, can be just as strong as the first layer in terms of security. And again, you've got to trust at some point the nodes that are processing the transactions, and if they're not processing right, you have to say, well, we don't want to work on your blockchain anymore, right? We've been through this already. You have to trust the blockchain nodes that do the work. But if you spread that work out, and elect honest people, it's a system where one guy can't just cheat and steal everybody's money, then you can have security at the second layer just like you do at the first layer.
So then in that regard, you could build true DeFi at the second layer, and you don't really need, other than maybe a few pieces of contact with the base layer. You just use the base. You could basically just use maybe your account management system from your base layer on your layer 2.
Yeah, I mean, so the fundamental thing that layer 1 adds is the ordering, because this is sort of a fundamental problem when you have a decentralized system. You send out a transaction, and somebody else sends out a transaction about the same time, and those transactions flow through the network. And when you have one central server, then that central server determines which transaction arrived there first. But when you have multiple nodes that are getting this data, and you don't know which one's going to produce, I mean, different people are producing the different next block. That guy's making the decision about the ordering, and everybody else has to say, okay, I accept that ordering. So it's that ordering of transactions. I mean, it sounds like such a minor thing, but that's the most important thing. That's one of the most important things that's being done, is deciding to order and then saying that order won't change. That's the immutability aspect of it. And that's kind of the fundamental thing that the layer 1 provides. So you don't have to do that again at the second layer. It's already been decided at the first layer. And then the interpretation of what those transactions mean can literally be done at the second layer, just the exact same way they're done at the first layer, with the same kind of safeguards in terms of multiple nodes processing and agreeing with coming to a consensus on what's the correct result.
So effectively, you'd build a blockchain on a blockchain.
That's exactly right. You can run multiple blockchains that process different data on top of a layer 1. And all the layer 1 does is basically handle that transaction flow and ordering. That's it.
And then using the security or looking at this from a resiliency standpoint, that gives you another line of defense against your base layer, because if there is something screwy, or if there is an attack, they're attacking the second layer, and the second layer node system, not your base layer.
That's right. That's right. So if there's some kind of performance issue that drags everything down, it won't drive down the base layer. If the second layer gets hacked in some way because of bad code, it still will not cause any problems in the base layer at all. It's a total firewall between the two.
Well, John, I mean, after hearing there might be something good going on with this Hive thing. What do you think? I mean,
That's what
should
I'm
we look
saying,
into
man.
it?
I mean, yeah, I'm gonna sell all my Solana and FTT and get into Hive now.
I'm not sure it's going to be worth much on the FTT side at this point.
I might get like 5 Hive from it, right? I mean, yeah. No, it's great, man. I mean, this is I obviously wave the Hive flag everywhere I go, and people come to me that are offline that aren't into crypto, and they always come to me and they go, "What's going on with crypto? The price." And broken record. I say, listen, this is what Hive has that everything else really doesn't: community, use case, and development. A lot of projects have community; they just want to see green candles. A lot of projects have use case other than trading bots, and then like for development it's like, yeah, it's Ethereum, but like it doesn't have the other two. Hive has everything. So the price, people get so stuck on the green candles and the price, and that's all they worry about. They don't look at what this is supposed to really represent.
Yeah,
and Hive does. So obviously we're fanboys, little bit of Hive maxis here.
Yeah, but like you said, it's a different kind of fanboy, right? We're not focused on just the price of Hive. That's not our goal. So, and that also makes the community very different, right? We're not all just looking for the next way to get rich quick. We're really trying to do something new and different and establish a new way to work with each other and cooperate together.
Well, I think you even see the difference on Twitter. When you see other communities on Twitter, what are they trying to do? They're trying to pump the price of the token. Whereas even the Hive, the Twitter Hive army, they take a different approach. You have people on there talking about blogging and different apps and Splinterlands and NFTs and all this stuff that we have going on in gaming and GameFi. And to me, that's just a totally different mindset than, as John likes to say, green candles, because I believe the wealth for people who are on Hive comes from the success of Hive with what we've discussed, building game-changing applications and systems and the way things are done, not because of some hype or some pump or because Cointelegraph had an article that says, "Oh, Hive's wonderful, buy it all now."
Yeah, I mean, hype is ultimately doesn't go anywhere in the long run, right? So you're just playing this game where you try to get in at the right moment and get off at the right moment if that's all you're going to do. So, and I'm just not interested in that. I like I said, we want to build something, a better system. That's what we're really focused on, not the price of Hive.
John, any questions from the peanut gallery? I'm kind of running out of questions here.
Yeah, no, it was good. It's lots of people on Vim checking out too. So we were using the Hive app use case community. I mean, we're at this thing. We want to practice what we preach here. So
I just watched Crimson Clad on there a couple of nights ago.
And she's fancy. She's our next guest.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, it's for
next
her
Tuesday,
first appearance.
She'll be on.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, dude, obviously appreciate everything you do for this blockchain, and obviously coming to the show. It's great to have your input, and of course my dog decides to start barking right at the end of the show, right? So if it's not a kid running around, it's jeez. Cool, man.
And we got through a show without any nudity with Dan on. So that's the goal. That's
why the camera's pointed
make
with
it
the
through
wall
a show
behind
without nudity.
Yeah. Perfect.
As long as John doesn't stand up, we honestly don't know how he is there. But we'll leave
I put on long pants just in case something happens, so I'm not in shorts.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, I've been working for myself for 20 plus years now. So, like, I still wear pants, man. But I don't know about a suit and tie. Anyways. Yeah.
You guys who've been working yourself and doing online stuff and coding and all that stuff. I mean, you were way ahead of the Zoom generation. So, since COVID, everybody's like learning about this video conference, and it's like, oh wait, I shouldn't do that like in my underwear. No, dude, don't.
Yeah, no.
But at least you had that part on. But yeah,
if you ever wonder why I don't have a lot of video.
He's naked all the time.
Dan comes on CryptoManiacs when he's not on video. He's hanging out at the local nude beach or the nudist colony, coming on doing the show. He's hanging out there, literally hanging out, just chilling, being one with nature. doing some code. Hey, well, drinking a few margaritas.
Oh,
So, Dan,
crazy.
I thank you too. It was a very informative program, and we look forward to some of your updates about half and the stuff you'll be doing over the next month. Getting that up to shape, and hopefully a lot of the developers will start to gravitate towards that. And I think that's really how we need Hive to explode, is to get developers tied into half, and they start seeing how easy it is to integrate new applications in the blockchain. I think that could be a game changer.
Yeah, that's absolutely where we're going for sure. And yeah, I'll probably post an update for too long. Been meaning to, just other things keep popping up. I guess on the side, I should mention we've added a few more developers too to our team. So we've got a few more guys. If you look at the GitLab, you might see a few new names there. But anyways, thanks a lot for having me on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you guys as always.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks.
Ciao all.